So the feminism, the notion of recognizing everybody's equality and humanity, period, right, which is the center of what I understand feminism to be, that is everywhere in the prison abolition. It should be everywhere in the prison abolition and restorative justice movement. So I just wanted to speak to Tiawanda's story, to say her name out loud for people who don't know her story, look it up, but also because the Supreme Court finally just came out saying that in Illinois, yes, you can audio tape the cops, right? That just happened this week. So.
Oh, hello. Thank you. Thanks, Miriam, because I think that you really led us into sort of the struggles I think those of us who work in the anti-violence communities have with, like, what else am I going to tell people, right? So, Jane, I have a question for you, right? And you work with the Prison Industrial Complex Teaching Collective, and you do amazing workshops. And I think everyone's always like, I don't want to do trainings with cops. They're so tough. But actually, social workers are much scarier than cops, right? And and so I've seen Jane sort of march up in front of a group of social workers and tell them to stop telling people to call the cops. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm leaving because they're gonna make Jane cry. And Jane does not cry. So if you could sort of talk a little bit about those conversations you have with members of the anti-violence community, but also sort of there's the inevitable, well, what else are we going to do, question when you say this system, the criminal legal system, is not working for us.
Sure, yeah. I think a great example of that was I presented along with Ches, who's in the audience back there, at the National Sexual Assault Conference in Chicago in August, and we did a workshop entitled Promoting Alternatives to the Prison Industrial Complex for Survivors of Sexual Assault, which any of you who've been to this conference know that it's a little bit, like Beth talks about in the book, it's the kind of the mainstreaming of this anti-violence movement. The people that are at this conference are the people that work for rape crisis centers, that work for states' attorneys' offices, judges, sexual assault DV counselors, people that do this professionally. And so having that kind of workshop in that setting was a little bit risky. We weren't really sure how that was going to go over. I actually was surprised that people were pretty receptive to that conversation. We started out by talking about, what are survivors getting and not getting from the criminal legal system. And the people that were in the room, there were 80 people that came to this workshop, which we were floored by, because we're used to doing these PIC 101 workshops for 15 people, not a lot of people. We have this popular education style. Had to kind of throw that out the window and do this more lecture kind of style thing. But the people that were in the room, a lot of sexual assault advocates, could really quickly name all the things that people aren't getting from the criminal legal system. They could talk about all the ways that people, in particular women of color, queer and trans women, are experiencing structural violence when they turn to this system as a recourse for the interpersonal violence that they've experienced. So people were on board for that, but then we got to the part of the conversation where we're okay, let's imagine what alternatives to this could look like, and we proposed a couple things. We played some audio clips from the Storytelling Organizing Project, which has collected stories about community alternatives to responding to sexual violence, domestic violence, and people were oh no, that's not gonna work. No, this, I get what you're saying, the system doesn't work, but what you're proposing also not an alternative. So it's, that part is really challenging. I think that people just really, like Miriam said, we're so entrenched in the system now, which, ironically, we don't actually, has not actually been a system that we've been using for, forever. There's nothing natural about the criminal legal system. We don't have to do it this way, but we're so entrenched in that system that we can't imagine what a viable alternative will look like. And I think part of that speaks to people not feeling particularly close to their communities, to other people in their neighborhoods. So when we talk about community-based alternatives, people say, well, what does my community look like? Who are the people in that community for me? Who would I even call? Who would I go to? So that's certainly one challenge. And I think people also expect us to give them a roadmap for how to do that, and that just doesn't exist. It's not when when you want to use the criminal legal system and, pick up the phone and call 911. There's not something that's so easy when we're thinking about alternatives, but also that's good, because one of the failures, again, of the system that we have now, again, as Beth points out in the book, is that we've created this system that works mostly for white middle-class women, and we don't want to do that again. We don't want to create another system that only works for some people. And so that's kind of the beauty of community alternatives, is that people can build up what they want it to look like. They can make it work for themselves and their community members. But that also makes it so hard when we try to talk about that, because people are like, I don't even know what that looks like. So I don't know if that kind of speaks to that question a little bit.
Thanks, Jane. I actually want to build on what Jane was saying about us being so entrenched in the criminal legal system as it is, and sort of accepting it the way that it looks, and all of its law and order strategies and tactics. Actually, I wanted to ask Erica to speak a little bit to one aspect of the criminal legal system that I think a lot of activists and scholars who work around the prison industrial complex have been unwilling to even touch, and that is the question of sex offenders and sex offender registries. Also, just so you know, Erica is a fabulous scholar and activist. She's also written this important book about the schools to prison pipeline. I'm not sure if we actually have copies here, but I just wanted to mention that and throw that out there, in addition to being a fabulous activist. But she has taken on this important question, I think, of sex offender registries. It is an issue that is complicated and hard, and it is something that no one wants to talk about. Erica's actually had some critique of the way that the sex offender registries have been used, and I wanted to ask her to talk about this phenomenon that currently exists, and how its relationship is actually problematic, and a little bit maybe about how the anti-violence movement has responded to some of those critiques. And I guess if there is time, if sex offender registries aren't the solution, then, just in terms of what Jane was speaking to, then how can we make our communities safer?
Okay, in 2 minutes, I'll try to address some of those wonderful questions. First, I just want to acknowledge all the fabulous people that are on the panel, Beth's book for making the space for these important conversations, and all the amazing folks that are in the room. I think there's so many organizers, so many thinkers, so many community builders here. It's really, I'm looking forward to a wonderful conversation. And also, I think Mary's point was so important, that most of us, the work that we do is the product of communities, is the product of dialogue, is the product of contradictions, and I think that I work with many organizations, many folks, many people, many groups, ad hoc, informal, and it's really humbling to be here and representing some of that thinking and working. So maybe I'll just set the context a teeny bit, because I came to thinking about sex offender registries and associated community notification laws, in part because I started doing a lot of work with people coming out of prisons and jails in Chicago, and I started that work when I moved here 15 years ago. And I started that work as an anti-racist, as a feminist, as a queer justice organizer. And a couple of years into doing the work, conversations kept coming up. I would be talking to men who are coming out of prisons and jails, and somewhere in that conversation it would come out that they're on the registry. And for me, as a feminist, as a queer, as an anti-racist organizer and thinker, I had to really sort of step back and start to think about my conceptions about what that category meant, sex offender, what my deepening understanding of the criminal justice system in the United States, which had led me towards thinking about prison abolition. I had to really, really do some work. And so I've spent the last 6 or 7 years as an organizer, as a scholar, as a thinker, demystifying, deconstructing sex offender registries, and trying to write for different kinds of audiences about that, whether it's more academic audiences, popular audiences, because I think that in some ways the sex offender registry is the affective part of the carceral state or the prison nation. It's what's pushing carceral expansion. It's what's pushing criminalization in the United States. And also, fundamentally, sex offender registries they're not effective. There's no efficacy in sex offender registries. They do nothing to reduce sexual violence that targets women and children. They actually, if anything, produce more forms of vulnerability to state and interpersonal violence, as Miriam was just talking about. So maybe I'll just hit a couple of the high points of, if I can make a depressing comment, attempt at a joke, about why sex offender registries and community notification laws are ineffective. I think that key point there is that they both erase and distract us from the real sources of sexual violence that target children and target women. And they recirculate this fear of stranger danger. We know that less than 5% of sexual assaults on children are perpetrated by strangers, yet we've constructed this complex system of tracking, of restricting mobility, employment, housing for people who are on the registry. So I think the key one is that if we think about, and this is sort of the critique of the larger prison nation in the United States, is that it masks our ability to actually get at some of the core problems and the core reasons for sexual and gendered and racial violence in the United States. And so if we think about the damage that, for example, patriarchy does to women and children, yet the focus on of our state is on stranger danger. I think that other point that I mentioned earlier is how sex offender registries and community notification laws really have scaffolded the carceral state in the United States. They're the push for getting people to think about deepening criminalization. And I think that another key thing that I know that Andrea is going to pick up on, because this has been some of her most amazing work, is how sex offender, even the category of the sex offender has been used flexibly. For example, last year in New Orleans, trans women in particular, trans women of color who were sex workers, were caught up under that category of sex offender. So I think those are just some of the key points I wanted to push at for deconstructing and thinking about sex offender registries, how they criminalize public space, how they distract us from some of the real core roots of violence, sexual violence, and how that they're being used to push our consent, to coerce our consent into building more prisons, putting more police on the streets, enhancing more surveillance. I think that's key.
Okay, I am going to ask Andrea, who has also worked on both of these issues. She's also been a part of the anti-violence movement and also the prison abolition movement for many years. She also co-authored a book called Queer Injustice, along with Joey Mogul, who is also here in the audience today, that I think really provides a more important analysis and a look at the experience of queer people, LGBTQ people as criminal defendants, prisoners, and survivors of violence. So I actually wanted to ask Andrea to talk a bit about the lessons that we've learned from the anti-violence movement to our approaches to homophobic and transphobic violence, and more generally, violence that targets queer people.
Thanks so much, Ellis. So I'm mindful that you all have been sitting here for a while, and I really want to give folks a chance to also speak back and celebrate Beth's book, but I'm going to ask your indulgence for a few minutes because that's a really big question. And I mean, I'll tell a little bit of the story about my work because I think it answers it a little bit. So my work with anti-violence and prison abolition movements actually began in Toronto in the 1990s when I was doing community organizing around violence and was a board member of a shelter for DV survivors and homeless women. And I was asked to serve on a city advisory board for something they were doing called a social audit of police responses to sexual assault, which meant that they were just looking at how the police respond to sexual assault in the city of Toronto and how they could improve those practices. So first of all, we were all very excited to be invited in the room, and we're all women of color, and we're all sitting at the city hall, and we're being asked to give our opinion, right? So we had totally bought in. And then...
Yeah, sorry. People are taking a bunch of pictures. Can you not put me in the photos if possible? Thank you. Appreciate it. Sorry,
No, I was like... And what was interesting is that in the course of that process of sort of listening to women talk about police response to sexual assault, we started hearing about police committing sexual assault.